Good afternoon. My name is John Hollway. I'm the Executive Director of the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice here at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. On behalf of my colleagues at the Quattrone Center, as well as my colleagues at Penn Law from Dean Ted Ruger throughout the organization, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Rescuing 911, Opportunities for Reform in Police Dispatch. This is part of Penn Law's ongoing series of conversations on achieving racial justice, a series set in motion last May when Minneapolis police officers killed George Floyd, and a conversation that has continued to support and promote an important national dialogue on criminal justice reform through a wide variety of productive and actionable conversations across a variety of topics. Those conversations, like this one will be, were recorded and are available on our website and our YouTube channel, and I encourage any of you who are interested to review and share them with others. I want to start by thanking a lot of the people that made this event possible, our Toll Public Interest Law Center and Penn Law's Office of Inclusion and Equity for their partnership in these conversations, and Andrew Margolis of Margolis Real Estate for his generous sponsorship of the event, and of course, Denise Foderaro and Frank Quattrone, our founding donors, for their vision and generosity in creating the center 8 years ago and their participation since that time. We're going to get to our fantastic and knowledgeable presenters in just a moment, but I do have a couple of housekeeping notes. There is a Q&A box that is open. If you look at the ribbon on the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the Q&A button, you can submit questions, which we will review, and we will get to as many of those as we can within the time period that we have. We do ask that you keep your questions topical and appropriate. We are also offering continuing legal education. If you are seeking CLA credit for today's event, there will be codes, 2 of them that are announced within the hour. Write down these codes. You'll have to enter them on a digital evaluation form once the event is over. You will have to submit that evaluation form to receive credits. The link was emailed in your confirmation email. If you don't get that email, you can circle back to us and we will help you. But the codes tell how long you've attended. Here's your first code. So be ready, get a pen and pencil. The first CLE code is PEARLS, like the jewels, P-E-A-R-L-S. So today we're going to talk about 911 and its role in undesired outcomes in policing and thoughts on how to make real-world improvements to the system. Actually, 911 is a relatively recent part of our system. The first 911 call, it was made in 1968 in Alabama. Since that time, it has spread across the country, and its adoption has now increased to the point where 99% of US citizens call 911 for all sorts of things, including things that might not be a real emergency. In an average year, the 911 system handles 240 million calls. That's about 600,000 calls per day. And the people who answer those calls are the first of our first responders. The decisions they make, the actions they take, and the information they provide and how they provide it necessarily has downstream impacts on the services provided by those we typically think of as first responders, our non-emergency personnel, police, fire, medical, behavioral personnel, or other assistants. While it's hard to argue that our system with 911 isn't better than what we had before, it's equally hard to argue that we have optimized the 911 system. Concerns of racial bias and discrimination have plagued it nationally for decades. People of a certain age, like say 50, will certainly remember Public Enemy's 1990 hit song, 911 is a Joke. Even back then, we were talking about the lack of response times to 911 calls in Black communities versus that was experienced in more affluent white communities. But here's what's true. Like most of our criminal justice system in the United States, 911 is fragmented and local, not truly national. There are over 5,700 primary and secondary public safety answering points in the US to handle 911 calls, and 3,000 counties that have their own 911 call centers. Each one of those is tied into its own system and only handles calls from its designated area. And 911 operators have to deal with an increasingly complex set of challenges, from people who speak different languages or are trying to communicate in the midst of a traumatic event that prevents them from providing clear information, dealing with traffic accidents, community crimes, domestic violence, drug overdoses, and other things. And so it's important to consider 911 when we think about the role of policing, as we have a national dialogue about whether we're asking our armed police to do too much, and whether there are situations that require intervention that could be helped more effectively without dispatching and police. So to have that conversation with us and to talk about opportunities for real world reform, we have three people with great depth and experience in the area, and I'd like to invite them to join me on the screen at this time as I'm briefly introducing them. First, we have Dr. Jessica Gillooly, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Policing Project at the New York University School of Law. Dr. Gillooly's research centers on the role of 911 in the criminal justice system, and she examines the process through which caller requests become police responses. A former 911 operator herself, part of her research examines the function of the 911 call taker in mediating caller requests, and another thread explores the public's reliance on 911 to identify potential organizational reforms that will rethink the current dispatch and response system. She has a really great paper that published in the summer of 2020 on this topic in the Journal of Criminology and Public Policy. We also have Washtenaw County Sheriff Jerry Clayton. Sheriff Clayton has been a public safety services professional for 30 years and is in his third term as the sheriff of Washtenaw County, which includes the city of Ann Arbor. He leads a department of 420 people that serves a population of over 350,000 people over a 720 square mile area. Among his many accolades, Sheriff Clayton was invited to the UN High Commission on Human Rights in 2017, where he presented at an international conference on law enforcement and bias-based policing in Geneva. And last but certainly not least, we have Assistant Chief Constable John Hawkins of the Police Service of Scotland. Among ACC Hawkins's portfolio is the role of Senior Responsible Officer for the local policing program, including its contact assessment model and contact strategy. ACC Hawkins was one of the leaders of Scotland's reprioritization of its police service, and in particular responsible for how to modify emergency response to prioritize care and service to the community rather than pure law enforcement. So I'd like to ask each of these leaders, starting with Dr. Gillooly, to give a brief summary of your thoughts on these complex topics, and then we'll move into a more interactive conversation. As this is happening, of course, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer them as time permits. Dr. Gillooly, take it away.
Thank you so much, John. So ever since the police killing of George Floyd, there's been growing focus on whether the footprint of policing is too large and if we can reduce it. And at the core of this question is something we don't think a lot about, which is the role of 911 and dispatch in policing. Data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics suggests, however, this is something we should be seriously considering when we talk about policing, because across many jurisdictions, roughly half of all police encounters are responsive to community member requests. One problem is that the 911 system is a one-size-fits-all system. So callers use the 911 system to ask for assistance with wide-ranging issues from addiction to homelessness to mental health crises to interpersonal conflict. And we've seen repeatedly in the media that choices to call 911 can reflect callers' implicit and explicit racial biases. 911 call takers and dispatchers have few options other than to send the police, and police show up despite not always being equipped with the skill set or resources to solve callers' problems. A second problem is that we don't have a firm grasp on what it is 911 call takers and dispatchers do with caller requests, or how their actions shape police encounters. Dispatch staff are often assumed to be conduits of information transfer, passing raw information on from caller to police. Yet I find through my research and experiences as a former 911 call taker that they cannot simply pass along this information. The information needs to be distilled down into smaller pieces and categorized into incident types. And central to this work is the need to appraise the risks of harm inherent in various calls for service by extracting, interpreting, and classifying caller information. How they go about carrying out these steps can set the trajectory of an entire incident. And a lack of serious discussion about the costs to community members that can come from sending the police or sending them primed for a high priority incident means that all too often the risks of over-response are overlooked. A third problem is that call-taking standards are lacking. For example, when a caller is uncertain or a problem ambiguous, call-taking standards generally are silent about which course of action a call taker should follow. As a result, discretion creeps into the process. In an article I'm working on using call for service data from my field site, I find that this discretion is largely unstructured and results in variation across call takers and how they classify the same types of calls. These findings only magnify the challenges to alternative responder models if call takers and dispatchers suddenly have to choose the appropriate level of response from a wider range of responder options. It's not difficult to imagine a scenario in which alternative responders are dispatched disproportionately in white neighborhoods, while police are disproportionately dispatched to communities of color, or alternative responders refuse to go to some calls without police present. So what kinds of institutional supports do call takers need to process calls? What if they could divert more of these calls to alternative responders with the skill sets and resources to solve them? How might that reduce the harms of policing, especially in communities of color? These questions are important and they're really hard to answer. I think part of the reason is because we still don't know a lot about the nature of caller requests or how they're transformed into police responses inside the dispatch center. And so that's why at the Policing Project, we have started conducting research into what police are asked to do by the public, how they are sent to the scene by dispatchers, and under what conditions other types of responders may be more appropriate. So through a series of research and demonstration projects, we're trying to incorporate 911 and dispatch into these broader conversations about police reform. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists on this panel who have done real work in this area on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Gillooly. Sheriff Clayton, why don't we turn to you next? You're a lot of experience with 911 and you've worked on improving it in your jurisdiction. Maybe talk a little bit about what it takes to get that done from your perspective.
Sure. So first, thanks for having me and giving me an opportunity to share some thoughts. I'll start by saying this: in our jurisdiction, we know that we're not done yet. We're not even close. We're just scratching the surface. But I want to provide a little bit of insight in terms of what's really driving our approach. So I think Dr. Gillooly sort of framed it for us, right, and made the case for change. And I think that's important. The big issue for us is what should that change be? And I agree in terms of, as we've talked about police reform, the many convenings I've been a part of, dispatch has been absent, which is a challenge in and of itself because they are really the gateway, and they don't like to embrace themselves as the first responder, but they are the first responder. They respond to calls for service that we get from individuals. So I think it's important. One of the things I'll challenge is what we have tried to think about it here is I'm not interested in much reform. I'm more interested in how do we evolve the systems. So we've been in office almost 12 years. We started this 12 years ago as an organization, and we started to include dispatch in a lot of those conversations. So why would you say evolve? I think because evolve, the way we define it is, that continuous change from something that's simpler, maybe worse, to a higher, more complex state. That's really what we're trying to achieve. And when we think about evolving 911, we should think about more than just evolving the technology, which is what everybody's attracted to. They can see it. Yes, we got more technology. We have to think about more than evolving the policies that drive the decision, more than just the training. Training like how do you manage bias influence calls, and really start thinking about how do we evolve the culture that exists within 911 centers. And think about it from this perspective. We cannot expect our dispatchers to receive calls, to think about how they process those calls, to dispatch those resources in a non-biased way if the climate and environment within the dispatch center itself is caustic and full of bias. So we have to take a step back and look at the system, look at what is causing some of the bias behaviors, and what are some of the basic assumptions that's driving dispatch. So that takes me to the historical piece. The other reason why I say evolve is, for me, reform means I'm building off of what already exists. And I think we need to take a step back and understand the history of 911. So you spoke to the first 911 call being in Alabama in '68, right? Haleyville was where it was called. Well, let's take a step back a little further. Let's understand the origin of how we got to 911. One of it being as a result of the Kerner Commission, which was commissioned by President Johnson, I believe, as part of his National Advisory on Commission of Civil Disorder, in response to over 20 disturbances that have been happening in prior years in a lot of our major cities. Those disturbances was driven around civil rights and civil unrest, and folks that are Black and brown feeling that not only the criminal justice system, but the country in and of itself was discriminatory, and there was disparate impact across the spectrum. So in response to the civil disorder, Johnson commissions the current commission, and amongst their findings is that the civil arrest in Black communities was really driven by racism in the country. So that's the first thing. The other finding that was really advocating for a more militaristic response from police to quell those civil disturbances. And then another one of the findings, which I think is really important, is that we needed to develop an emergency response system to expedite police response to these civil disturbances. And part of 911 was based off of what was done in another country, in Venezuela, in response to what was going on there, funded by US money that now is influencing the 911 system. So I'll also say this piece. It wasn't just that, you know, International Association of Fire Chiefs talked about the need for response, but a lot of it was driven by this need to quell racial unrest. So think about that being the origin. And think about that being the origin the same way we say in police, if you really want to change, you have to understand the reforms needed in police based on history and the impact on the Black and brown community. So I say all that to say this, as we think about how we evolve 911, let's not put ourselves in a position to make the same mistakes that we made in 68 and beyond by not understanding that history. And let's focus a lot of our attention, not just in technology, policy, training, and operational protocol, but also in culture, recognizing that we get our dispatchers from the same society that has perpetuated white supremacy and disparate impact on people of color for 400 years. Let's be mindful of that. Let's not run away from it. Let's embrace it. And that's part of the discussion that we've started in our place. And I think if you try all the other reforms without addressing the cultural impact, we're going to be right here 10, 15 years from now having the same discussion.
And certainly, I think that cultural impact is operating on both sides of the phone, right? We need to, and we'll talk about that as the conversation unfolds. Chief Constable Hawkins, thanks for coming to us from across the pond. In 2013, the Scottish Police Service was really faced with this wonderful opportunity to rethink the way it approached policing, and you were a big part of the emergency response to that. Can you tell us about the philosophies that drove that process?
Of course, it would be a pleasure to, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all. It's this evening here, but I appreciate it's lunchtime with you. And that's what I thought I would do, give you a sense of a different approach to public contact, and not from a basis of claiming it's better or worse, but simply a different approach. And I think, just as you've said, John, it might be helpful just to say a little bit about the creation of Police Scotland in 2013 first. So while we're a very young organisation, there's been policing in communities in Scotland for 200 years. And we can plot our history and tradition back to Sir Robert Peel and the Peelian principles in 1829. And Sir Robert Peel said quite simply that the police are the public and the public are the police. And that is something that's really important to us, that issue of legitimacy and the legitimacy of policing in local communities. So to give you a sense of scale, we're the second biggest police service in the United Kingdom now. We're just behind the Metropolitan Police. We've 23,000 in our workforce, 17,000 police officers and 6,000 members of civilian staff. And interestingly, when we were enacted in 2013, the purpose of policing was defined very clearly. And it was to contribute to the safety and well-being of people and places and communities. So it's a different mission to a simple law enforcement mission. Law enforcement is important to us, but we have a broader purpose. And that broader purpose works its way right into our approach to public contact. And I do think that relationship between the police service and the public is right at the heart of a legitimate policing service. So it's really important business for us. So we receive 3.2 million calls from the public each year. It's a call every 9 seconds. And we have sort of two main services. We have a 999 emergency line, I guess, similar to the 911 line I've been hearing about. But we've also got a 101 line, which is a non-emergency line as well. Now, when we looked around the time we created the National Service at those 3.2 million calls, we were quite startled by the fact that less than 20% of them actually result in a crime being recorded. Overwhelmingly, the calls on our service are in this space of vulnerability, whether that's mental health, whether it's addiction, whether it's lost and missing people. But the huge draw on our service was around vulnerability in its broadest sense. And that's caused us to set about, interesting hearing Jerry's last input, but it's led to us seeking to bring about a cultural change in terms of the way in which we deal with the calls from the public. And there are two things in particular I just wanted to describe to you, two interventions. Our first one is called our contact assessment model, or CAM, where we've introduced a new, I guess, triage and assessment process. We ask callers more questions, and we use the Thrive mnemonic. So that sort of approach is designed to elicit information about threat, harm, risk, investigative opportunities, issues of vulnerability, and the expectation of the member of the public. We used to focus on a crime type and mobilize based on the type of crime. We've moved away from that. We take more time to find out what the circumstances are, and we've given more discretion to our people to come up with the most appropriate response. And the other thing I wanted to touch upon very quickly was our mental health pathway. We've noticed specifically a real increase of police officers being dispatched to deal with issues of mental health. And it often leads, in our experience, in my humble opinion, to a suboptimal outcome where law enforcement and police officers try and deal with a health issue. So our mental health pathway has seen our ability to refer non-urgent, non-violent mental health matters in early course into a mental health hub, which is housed by our National Health Service. There, the caller, very often seeking some fairly low-level resolution, a new appointment or a replacement prescription, or to be put in contact with a health professional, has their issue addressed without it escalating. So looking to the future, we think that's an area that we have to invest in more. Our focus on vulnerability and our focus on resolving issues at the first point of contact wherever we can. So a little flavor from the other side of the pond, John.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So maybe I'll sort of open this up to the three of you with a question that's kind of structural, and it's raised by a question that's in the chat, but I think it goes a little bit more broadly. So as I mentioned, there's 5,700 sort of 911 jurisdictions across the country. We've got 18,000 police departments that might be responding to things around the country. The Scottish Police Service is one organization. So, one question is sort of the amount of scale that we need to effectively run 911. But another question that we have, and I think it goes to the sort of cultural question that you all have raised, is that there can sometimes be concern that if you have a 911 center within a law enforcement organization, it will take on the identity of that law enforcement organization as part of its mission. And in the United States, there's some concern that that might interfere with the sort of care and mental health pathway and use of the Thrive and things, Constable Hawkins, that you're talking about. We have a similar conversation with forensic science, for example, about whether the scientists should be inside or outside law enforcement because of potential identification concerns. And so there seems to be this tension because often the police are going to be responding to things. So having the ability to control that creates some efficiencies and ability to implement some of these things we might be talking about. But then there's this question about identification and whether everything that gets funneled then through armed police. So, big topic, but I just, be interested in any of your thoughts on that. And I don't know, Sheriff Clayton, maybe just start with you, but again, thrilled to have all of your responses.
Sure, I sort of smiled because I was writing down my notes. Over 18,000 police agencies. There's an argument about what that number is. It should be concerning that should be concerning in and of itself, but we can't nail the number. And over 57,000 PSAPs. So now we know criminal justice, public safety is a local issue. So even if we institute national standards of training and things like that, you can't institute national values in terms of how those services are delivered. And I think that's really, really important. The kind of service and the level of service is going to be reflective of the community values and what the community's expectations are. So we talk about dispatch, we talk about police in this sense of isolation. The police, oftentimes, how they do their job and what they do is reflective of community values. It's collective of societal expectations. So we can't talk about evolution or reform without talking about a change in societal perspective about the role that police, dispatch, community responders play in this whole sense of public safety. I think we start by shifting part of our thought process from crime analysis to harm analysis. I think exactly to what Constable Hawkins talked about. So we start talking and thinking about it that way. That I think it is inaccurate to believe that if you place a 911 in a police agency, it's going to automatically take on that persona different from someone else. If the police agency has a human services approach, which is we've tried to embrace here, if we understand what our role is, if you really challenge the basic assumptions of what a community responder is and what it should be, and the role that dispatch plays in terms of receiving information, assessing that information, and dispatching the appropriate resource based on a deliberate articulation of criteria and role, then I think you can achieve the outcome that you want. My concern is always this: we start with the solution first. In our community, I want to have a conversation about, let's define what public safety means. Let's define from a community's perspective what your expectations are. If we did everything right, regardless of what everything is, what would the impact be? What would the value be? What would your experience be? And then you work backwards from there to develop your strategies, your operational protocols, and then you talk about the structure. Maybe based on what we want in terms of outcomes and the strategy to get there, we may have what we call a continuum of community responder structure, which goes from police, co-responder with police and clinicians, to just clinicians responding, and you build it out that way. And then you have a communication center, a dispatch center, that is now redesigned to facilitate that. And you fund it in that way. So I just take a little bit of, I'll push back with the assumption that just because it's in police, you're going to have this outcome. You may get that if you're not thoughtful in how you construct what you ultimately want.
Yeah, as you bring up the 5,700 different PSAPs, it's always been an issue in my research because I worked in one call center. A lot of the research is on that one place, and there's so many across the country. So that's why I'm really excited that, the work at the Policing Project, we're trying to go into more communities to get a sense of what local contexts look across the US a little bit more, because there's so little research on this topic. In terms of outcomes, one of the things that kind of strikes me in call for service data, a lot of the outcomes are about arrest or citation or unable to locate, which is a very vague term. But there's no kind of capturing, oh, the officer went out and they made a really helpful referral, or the officer went out and they mediated the situation and resolved the caller's issue. So I think this idea of what are the outcomes we want to be capturing, they're just not, they don't seem to be captured right now. And I think that they could be really important, like Sheriff Clayton mentioned.
It sounds like you'd actually be interested in a 5-star customer service rating after a response to an emergency or non-emergency call that's handled by one of these dispatch centers.
Well, I might come to that actually, John. A couple of other thoughts from me. So I think you've got a huge opportunity in the US at this moment, and I am struck by, I think there is a need to have a broad perspective and broad conversations. I think the most important thing has to be that the citizen gets the right response from the right organization that can address their need and their moment of need. That needs to be the outcome that all public servants sign up to try and help achieve. So I think that's an important first point, and I do think probably taking a cross-agency perspective of public contact might be sensible. I think training in terms of how you train your staff in service centres and call rooms is something we've thought long and hard about. So We have sort of 10 to 12 weeks training before folk will answer the phone for the first time. We've done an awful lot of building training with direct input from external groups, from interest groups, from all sorts of different communities to give us their insight in how it feels from their perspective. And that's been hugely helpful. I think there is a role for evaluation and inspection, asking the hard questions yourself about your own organization, about how well things are going, and not to be frightened about sharing that. I think the public gain a lot of confidence from that level of openness and clear desire to improve things. And then finally, in terms of your 5-star service, I think two of the things in recent years we've started to really focus on is assessments of public confidence and user satisfaction. So public confidence being the assessment that a society has or doesn't have in its police service in this instance, many of whom don't use the service, haven't experienced it, but have a view based on their life experience, and user satisfaction, the sense of how well it went for that individual. And interestingly, we pay real attention to that. So in our public contact sort of side of the business, we asked 1,200 people each month how they felt it went. And one of the stats I pay interest to is initial contact, how the initial call went. And last month we had an 88% level of satisfaction, which now I'm not just telling you that because that was a good month. I'm making that point more about there are ways of looking beyond, to take on Jessica's point, response rate, or was there an arrest, or how many arrests, or how much commodity was recovered, or whatever the traditional law enforcement stat might be. Actually asking the member of the public how it was for them, I think is a very powerful kind of thing to consider doing. But as I say, I think you've got a real opportunity in the US.
So in the first place, I think it's wonderful that you're gathering all that data. And I don't know, Dr. Gillooly, how many of the PSAPs gather that kind of data and analyze that, but there doesn't seem to be a sort of national data set that we can turn to. So how are you and the policing project working to enhance the data set? Because it would seem that to answer some of the questions that Sheriff Clayton is asking and that Constable Hawkins is looking at, we would need the data as a starting point to guide us.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as I mentioned, the call for service data is pretty at the local level. So each call center typically uses computer-aided dispatch software, and that software captures calls that are put into the system, and the call for service data is kind of created from the CAD software. And so we've been thinking about, one thing, just by working with more jurisdictions, trying to collect data from more sites, but then we come up to the problem of, well, we're not going to be able to do that for every single jurisdiction across the US. So we've been talking about if there are ways to create frameworks kind of based on collecting data from a few places about how we think an agency could go about collecting the data we think are important. So we're kind of meeting with technologists and some quantitative researchers to see if there are frameworks that organizations could use. And we've also, there are some computer-aided dispatch software companies that are interested in these conversations about reform. And so thinking about, are there other kinds of outcomes that data in the dispatch software could collect, is something that, we are really excited to talk to them about. Because right now, as I said, and others said, we just don't have a good sense of what happens when the police get there for a lot of these calls, what the outcomes are.
So I'd like to turn to I guess a question on that sort of spectrum, Sheriff Clayton, that you mentioned of the services that one might deploy. And Constable Hawkins, I don't know if your officers or your responders are armed or how you handle this, but we've looked and worked with departments on these questions of, do armed officers need to be deployed to all of the calls? And clearly the answer seems to be no, not all of them. But we also know that there are domestic violence instances or mental health instances that could turn violent quickly. And we obviously don't want to put clinical responders in harm's way. So I guess I'm curious again for all of you for thoughts on methodologies for understanding those distinctions and handling that triage at the telecommunications hub that is responding to this. So open question for the three of you again.
So our officers aren't all armed. We have a sort of a fairly small proportion that carry firearms that are on. Oh, excuse me. I had to put some more money in the meter.
Energy efficiency at its finest.
Exactly. That's what it's all about. So we've a relatively small number of officers that are armed, but they're on duty 24/7 in each of our locations across the country. We've a bigger number who carry taser as a less lethal option. Again, there's additional control and command around those. But it's an ongoing debate in these islands about the degree to which officers should carry arms to a greater degree. The counter argument is that issue of community policing and the obvious sort of barrier that you can sort of, I suppose, build between communities if everybody is armed. But I appreciate kind of we have a different kind of approach to the availability of firearms and to gun control than you have in the US.
I think I'll start my response with the obvious, right? The prevalence of guns, firearms in the U.S. is overwhelmingly more than any other country, Scotland included. So this thought about disarming police in a country where everybody in this country could have a firearm if they chose to have one, because there's so many available in this country. So it's almost an apples and oranges conversation to start off with. I think that there is an opportunity for us to move in a direction where some of the response are with unarmed individuals. I just think we need to take our time to think about what are those situations. Let's make sure we examine the scenarios where we get a call. Look, we have a lot of calls that start as a very mild call with no indication of violence, no indication of behavior that would lead a reasonable person to think someone is going to put other folks in danger. And then it evolves into that. And it didn't evolve because the police made it evolve. It evolved because the situation evolved. So we just need to be mindful of that. I would start with what we're trying to do here is I just start asking the clinicians, help us understand what situations you would be comfortable in responding to a situation unarmed without any police support. Because what we're talking about is sending them to the calls. So we can't develop a strategy to send them to the calls without talking to them about what they're comfortable doing. And I've talked to enough clinicians, they'll say a lot of times, they already staged waiting for police to come. Now, in other instances, they have clients where they go all the time without any police intervention. So I think there's some opportunity. I just think we need to be thoughtful in terms of how we do that. And I'll end with this piece. As we explore this and we start to set up strategies, just because we start with this strategy doesn't mean we have to end with it. So let's put it in place. Let's evaluate impact and move in that direction. I'm a proponent of a continuum of responders, that it doesn't always have to be the police, doesn't always have to be armed. I just want us to do it in a thoughtful way where there aren't any disastrous unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think John's question is a key question of how do you make these distinctions? And one I thought about as a former call taker of, okay, am I going to send someone else? Who would I send? What are the criteria that are going to be given to call takers to make these really consequential decisions, right? It's one thing to send the police at a lower level versus a higher level. It's a whole nother thing to not send the police at all and send someone unarmed. So I think those are going to be hugely consequential decisions. Some of the kind of articles I've been reading that have come out recently around alternative dispatch, I think have made, they haven't been as fine-grained about how to kind of draw these distinctions. So I've seen people look at call for service data and say, oh, high priority calls, we would send police. Lower and medium priority calls we'll try and send to some other sort of responder. And I think that that's not nuanced enough because there are a lot of high priority calls that, do need police and low priority calls that still need police because they could escalate, or there might be some a weapon or something that's not going to be captured in the incident classification. So I think we need to be really careful, like Sheriff Clayton said, about how we make these decisions. And that's something, again, I'm really excited to learn from places that have started putting in alternative responder models, ones that have had them around for a while, to see how they've gone about this and how call takers on the ground are kind of carrying out the making these distinctions.
John, if I may just add one more piece, because I don't want to lose sight of, there's all this work around 911 and evolving it and reforming it in the context of disparate impact on people of color. So even if we get to the point where we settle on a strategy for sometimes you send armed and sometimes you don't, we need to be really careful about when we sometimes send armed and sometimes don't. I mean, we already get a sense that sometimes it's geographical bias, that we know we have communities where a dispatch center dispatches into more white or affluent communities, and this also dispatch for communities of color, more socioeconomically challenged. And we need to be mindful is when that call comes in, is there an unconscious bias based on geographical location that influences their perception of the call and the caller and how that's going to be sent out? So all the other things that we're talking about, I still don't want us to lose sight of. This is really about people. It's about culture. It's about how do we manage bias that we know will influence the outcomes regardless of what we put in place, unless we're mindful of it and put, guardrails in place to try to make sure that doesn't happen.
One of the things that we did, which might be worth thinking about, is almost the black box thinking idea, which is kind of countercultural in many ways in policing, where we ask our staff to tell us when things didn't go very well, and we thank them for that, and we take it and we learn from it, and we make sure we do learn from it. So we've called that our notable incident process, and thankfully we've a small number, but there's a really rich opportunity to learn, and again, I think it does something for staff when it's clear that it's not a blame culture, but actually we're humans. We do get it wrong sometimes, but actually we're trying to learn together. So that's something that's worked well for us, which might be just a little practical step that might help.
Yeah, getting away from the blame culture, I think, is something that, from a systems improvement perspective, I think has been proven time and time again in the criminal justice system, where people's jobs every day are to allocate blame. I think it can be hard to kick the rudder on that mindset. We did a review of a death in custody in the Tucson Police Department over the summer, and it was an interesting and obviously a tragedy. A Spanish-speaking grandmother called on behalf of her grandson, who was clearly in the midst of a substance abuse overdose. He was naked, unarmed, but also not preventing her from leaving. The call taker brought up the individual's criminal history and included an open domestic violence warrant, which then colored the perspective of the police that were going to the scene. And we had a clinical nurse who, and this is to get to your point about the language of things, there was a clinical nurse who was part of our review, and she said, look, when you hear the word naked, that should be a code word that this is a behavioral health challenge and not an armed police threat. And if there are words like that we can begin to train call takers on, and Dr. Gillooly, you've done this job, right? So I don't want to sit out here and sort of come up with brilliant, simple solutions that don't have any feasibility. Is there some possibility for that kind of training? Can it be that nuanced? Are there lists of words? I mean, how should we be thinking about that to enable somebody in your position to do the job that they really want to be able to do?
That's a great question. I think including kind of mental health responders into the conversation with call takers to have more robust training would be hugely helpful. That's not something that I really felt strongly trained on. It was much more, I think someone said earlier, about kind of matching whatever the caller was saying to some sort of incident type in the computer system, because you can't get the police going until you pick an incident type in the system. And so trying to just figure out what this thing is closest to lets you get the police response going. So I think that's one issue, but also, yeah, I think certain code words could be very helpful to know from a mental health perspective around what call takers should be looking for. I think some probably get familiar with that with working for many more years than I worked doing it. But I think that, yeah, there is potential there. I also think, going back to John's point about kind kind of learning from when things didn't go well. One of the hard parts at 911 is it's hard to do organizational learning because you don't find out the outcome of a lot of calls at the call center. Calls are coming in so quickly that you answer it, you put it in, and you move to the next one. And typically you don't find out kind of how it all played out unless something not good transpired. And then maybe the call taker will be included in an incident debrief with the police, with everyone else who was involved in the incident, but that doesn't even always happen. So I think more opportunities for dispatchers and call takers to sit in on those events, to share their experiences could be very helpful. And also to make them feel more like they are part of the criminal justice system. They are the first responder in this huge chain of events, and their decisions do matter. They're not just passing on this information. What they do is going to shape the whole incident.
I think maybe just building on that too, another couple of just thoughts about how you might take it forward. Something again which is under consideration in many places here is having mental health practitioners within the police call centre. So community psychiatric nurses taking a view of the presenting information, and I suppose that goes to the word naked and the interpretation of that. And the other is a response model which would see a police officer and a mental health practitioner responding together. So both offer an opportunity for the incident to take a slightly different turn, perhaps, than ultimately ending up in a purist law enforcement scenario where the individual gets brought into the criminal justice system. But both of those are perhaps worthy of thought as well.
And so that's just to make sure I'm hearing you right, that would be a situation where when the call comes in, the telecommunicator who receives the call is supported by, in real time, a mental health expert who can help interpret the language, the situation, based on that in-depth clinical training that they've received over many years, which obviously would be challenging to impart to every person receiving a call.
Yes, and who also has access to health data and information, and quite probably the health record. So yes.
Interesting. And so in Scotland, do you have kind of both of those databases accessible in the telecommunication center, where you can see both, the scenario that I gave where you're looking at an arrest record, but also then somebody's health record?
So we're not quite there. So we have our mental health pathway, which sees the low level call going into the health setting. We think the next step is to bring community psychiatric nurses into the call center so that at the first point of assessment, they'll be there to help. So you can call the individual over and get their eyes on the presenting situation and get some hot advice about what might or might not be sensible to consider. Interesting.
So let me ask this question, because I think Sheriff Clayton, at the beginning, one of the things that you made the point of was that the 911 call takers are operating in a larger community. And so a lot of the situations that we've seen that hit the news about are from people who call in and report, quote unquote, suspicious activity. And so part of the challenge is how to differentiate between truly suspicious activity. And I'm going to use an expression from Oregon. Oregon actually wanted to pass a law that would make it a misdemeanor. And the way that it was phrased, at least in the article that I saw on this, was they wanted to make it a misdemeanor if you called in basically to complain about Black people living their lives, and reporting that as suspicious activity, right? So I guess one question is there training that we can give to call takers that will coach callers on how to gather the information we need to differentiate those things, number one. And number two, I feel like as lawyers, I probably shouldn't criticize people for creating laws about things, but do we need a law for that? Is that a helpful reform, or maybe are there other ways we can go about this?
So two things. I think so the law would only go so far, right? So then you could write the law. Now you got to prove the law, right? Now you got to prove intent. I mean, you're a lawyer, you know all the things that go along with that. So that would be difficult, and that's still after the fact. So now I'm gonna hold you accountable after you have made a call and police have responded, and you've caused harm to someone that wasn't doing anything worthy of a police response. So that's out there. So we have worked on what we call bias influence caller training. So we have we've set that up and we're rolling it out to our folks. So again, it's still just a training piece that establishes some criteria. So think about it like from this perspective. The same thing that we say to police officers. You're looking for suspicious behavior. So when the call comes in, the instruction to the dispatchers to take in the information, if they say there's a suspicious person, the logical follow-up call is, okay, ma'am or sir, what makes them suspicious? And now we're trying to get them to articulate the behavior that causes someone to be seen as suspicious in the caller's eyes. It's important for a couple of reasons. I want to be able to discern whether the call is bias influence or not, but also police officers want as much information as possible. So the dispatcher's ability to get that information, to get the caller to articulate the behavior, and then to give that to the police officer. Now the police officer is better positioned. They may make the call and may make the run, but now I know behavior and it doesn't rise up to that level. I might just roll up and just watch. I might not initiate contact. So that's part of it. We need to get better in terms of instructing our staff and setting policy for them to make a decision about what path to follow. And let me end with this piece. Most dispatch centers dispatch for more than one police agency. So I'll just give our example. We talk about bias influence calls, and then what we'll say is the dispatcher's not going to make the call. They're going to take the information, say we believe it's bias influence, and then give it to the patrol commander. Sarge, Lieutenant, this is what we have. We think it's bias influence. Do you want us to send a resource or not? And then the police commander makes that call. If the police commander's been trained in the same thing that the dispatcher's been trained in, then maybe we can start to mitigate the risk associated with a bias-based call. The cultural piece is to get away from in terms of covering our backside, we're going to send somebody to every call. That really is the dispatch mantra. We're going to dispatch everything. We got to move away from that and then strategically figure out how do we not dispatch someone to a call. And if we don't do that, let's make sure it's in alignment with police. And I'll say the last piece, and we've talked about this here, we haven't gotten there yet, is we have to start doing some community education and calling the community out and say, look, this is what a bias influence call is. This is what a call is that when you call into us, we're going to ask you a series of questions and we might not send anybody. And then the elected officials have to have the will to stand by that because they're going to get pushback from some of the public that's going to challenge it. And in a lot of places, dispatch centers are run by, from a municipal standpoint, and they're at the whim of a city manager, a mayor, or city council. So it's not as easy as just saying we're going to do this. I think there are a lot of factors that we just need to consider.
I'm just maybe building on that, and again, I appreciate we're in different jurisdictions, but as we moved away from dispatching officers to everything, to one in which we sought to resolve more remotely, because we felt that was a more appropriate way to provide a quick response for lower level issues, and also to keep the officers for the jobs we really needed them to go to. We were amazed at how well the public took to that, to be honest. And I think it's certainly in the UK, it's a sign of the times where I think people are really busy, and if they find 5 minutes in their busy day to phone the police, it's absolutely brilliant if they get a response and their matter resolved immediately, even if it's over the telephone. So our perception that people would want to see police officers at each and every call just didn't come to reality. So it might be worth sort of exploring that, certainly with, as you say, that public communication and managing expectations. I think people increasingly for lower level matters just want it resolved quickly.
So I have to insert here that the second CLE code, I feel like I'm doing commercial announcements, is ice cream, like the dessert, ICECREAM. And then I'd like to turn, Dr. Gillooly, we've got about 3 minutes left. I'd like to give you kind of a last word on this because your paper from the summer, which I really, really loved, and I think everybody in the country should read, was on exactly this topic.
Thank you. Yeah, suspicious calls are something I've been really interested in because as a call taker, it is very difficult to sit in the chair and hear what seems to be a racially biased call about someone not belonging in a certain neighborhood and not having any power to do anything but send the police and know that you are initiating a potentially very problematic police encounter. So I think, we talked about culture at the beginning of the panel today. There is definitely a culture in some call centers around customer service and giving the caller what they're asking for. So I think shifting that a bit is important, or at least recognizing that sometimes callers are going to make requests on the police that are problematic and go kind of deal with it the way Sheriff Clayton suggested. I also think suspicious person calls, they make it difficult. A call taker needs to be empowered to be a gatekeeper, I would say, on some level. So socio-legal scholars write about reactive systems of law versus proactive systems. Reactive systems are citizen-driven, and call-driven policing is an example. And the scholars who write about this say that reactive systems of law require effective gatekeepers to keep out inappropriate requests from entering the system. And so I think it's a gradual shift on how to empower a call taker to be a gatekeeper. It might not be straight up rejecting the call. Maybe it is getting more information, passing that on to the police so they can, as Sheriff Clayton said, roll by, but not engage with the person. That's one way. I've spoken to people at Seattle 911, and they have some policies in place that kind of differentiate between suspicious appearance and suspicious behaviors. And they do dispatch if the behavior or action is suspicious, but if it's just someone appearing suspicious, they do not necessarily dispatch the police. And so language like that, having criteria in place, could be very helpful, because often a suspicious person call is defined as any situation, person, or vehicle that a caller deems suspicious. And so with that definition, you are giving incredible latitude to a caller to define what they think is suspicious, and bias certainly enters the system through that.
Thank you. I think it's actually a very helpful framework. So I really appreciate your kind of giving the proactive, reactive, and the gatekeeper as a framework for thinking about that, which definitely helps me personally. So we are at the bottom of the hour, unfortunately, and it's almost probably midnight in Scotland. So I want to thank Dr. Gillooly, Sheriff Clayton, Constable Hawkins for your thoughtful remarks, and I want to thank all of our attendants, the people that are here, for their attendance, participation, and questions. I also want to invite everybody to join Penn Law next week. The Toll Public Interest Center, Black Law Students Association, and others are putting on our annual Public Interest Week, a week of fantastic speakers and presentations, including Howard Stevenson from Penn, DeRay McKesson, and an interdisciplinary look at the attack on the U.S. Capitol that's moderated by Wharton Dean Erica James and our own law school dean, Ted Ruger. Always a good idea to mispronounce your dean's name at the end of a webinar. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to further conversations, but this has been incredibly interesting and helpful, and everybody be well. Thanks very much.